Welcome to Season 2 of WitchLit, a space to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. Hi, it's Editing Victoria. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that there is a brief discussion of suicide in this episode. Terence P. Ward, author of Empty Cauldrons, Navigating Depression Through Magic and Ritual, has been exploring a pagan past since the mid-20th century. Terence's early post-Christian devotion was shamanic and animist, with a strong desire to fly with eagles and dance naked with trees. Terence was eventually bound to a coven as its jester, and thereafter followed the boundless path of the fool in all its archetypal glory. Terence has dabbled with Druidry, experimented as an Episcopalian, practiced pantheism, and greeted the Green Man as a devoted follower. Eventually, Terence was mired in the miasma of life until yanked out forcibly by one of the gods of the Hellenes, those kick-ass ancient deities whose myths have been retold for millennia, and that was that. Terence P. Ward, welcome to WitchLit.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad to have you on, and thoroughly enjoyed your book, and so I'm glad we get to talk about that. And our opening question for everybody is, why write?
Yeah, I don't think that it's ever been a question for me. I had a father who wrote for a living in some of the most boring stuff you can imagine. It was technical writing, flight manuals for military aircraft, really dull stuff. But what my parents both did is they did a lot of reading to their children, and that somehow led to me being that kid that was picked on for having a gigantic vocabulary. And after I realized that communicating out loud can be tricky, I learned that writing is a better way to express myself. It gives yourself an opportunity to think and reflect and connect with who you are and where you're at when the words hit the page or the screen.
Yeah, I too was one of those kids who was picked on for having a big vocabulary, especially words I couldn't pronounce properly because I'd only seen them written down.
I know the type.
Yeah, to this day, I still sound out melancholy because I think for years, when I was a kid, I thought it was melancholy.
That makes sense. If you don't have anyone to talk to about this stuff, how are you going to know?
Yeah, especially with English, because, my husband always jokes English is 3 raccoons in a trench coat. So what was your writing journey into getting published? I know you published some self-published books as well as this new book with Llewellyn. So what's kind of been your publishing journey?
When the self-published stuff really came from beyond me, the first book that I wrote and published on my own was a devotional to Poseidon called Depths of Praise. And it was actually kind of a requirement of my relationship with Poseidon. It was a very difficult relationship for me for a while after I discovered it was real. And I finally got the instruction that the way to know Poseidon is to write hymns about his various epithets. And I spent a month waking up with him on my mind and writing it. And it eventually led to me publishing it as a book. And I think several people might have even read it. I mean, as for my formal publishing journey, it really was, it comes from the fact that I'm a journalist. And as a journalist, I write mostly for weekly papers in my area, and I eventually had the opportunity to be a reporter for The Wild Hunt, which I thought was a wonderful merging of my background and in both my interests and my professional capacity. And through that, I got to know the wonderful Heather Green, who was at the time the the managing editor there, and has since become an acquisitions editor at Llewellyn. While we were together at the Wild Hunt, I took my first stab at writing about depression by writing a little blog post about my experience of depression as a spirit, because I'm an animist and I think like that. Mm-hmm. And Heather approached me and said, why don't you write an article about pagan approaches to dealing with depression? And I did, and it became one of the most read articles on the Wild Hunt for a number of years. I don't know if it still is, but it certainly was for a long time. And thus, when we were both not with that organization, Heather approached me again and said, I'm an acquisitions editor now at Llewellyn, and I think there is a place for a book about depression, and I think you're the person to write it. And I gave it some thought, and it wasn't the book I necessarily would have asked to write, but I recognized what Heather was talking about, how I probably could write it. And I knew I wanted to write a bigger book. I wanted to write something with a publisher, and I didn't know what the in would be, because it can be complex to do a cold pitch. And through this wonderful confluence of events, I didn't have to do a cold pitch. And Heather really helped me craft what I was asking to do, and did a very good job of advocating for it. And now we're here, and I'm still a little bit overwhelmed by how quickly it seems to have been, even though it took forever.
Yeah, I don't know. Having talked to a lot of authors and just knowing friends who are authors, I think it's always interesting, kind of that, like, the book you want to write versus the book that you can get published. Like that, it's like there's a space for something that you could write in the market, and then how do you also write the thing you want to write? And I think with the advent of self-publishing and smaller presses, and there's a lot more space in that way, but it's still, like you said, it's an interesting thing to navigate. So you write for newspapers, and I saw from your website you do some editing. So are you pretty much a full-time writer at this point, or full-time writer and editor?
It depends on how you define that. I have had hourly jobs or salary jobs for most of my life. And I would say that at least for the past 15 years, I've made sure that writing is a focus of the work that I do, even if it's not in the job description. Mm-hmm. It might mean that I'm writing blog posts for a veterinarian or an attorney, or doing press releases through that job. And I haven't yet wholly gotten to writing. I would love to be able to do that. I'm so envious of the people that can churn out like 2 books a year, because they have the time and the focus, and I've got a mortgage I want to pay off before my wife retires. And it's a tricky balance. I might be able to make more money writing, but I haven't made that leap of faith yet, or we haven't made that leap of faith yet, because that's a family decision.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that that kind of work writing, the copywriting, does that like take away from the brain space you have for more creative writing projects, or does it just kind of feed the loop for you?
I find that the relationship between them is interesting. The more I write, for one thing. If you look at my website, at my blog, you'll see huge gaps in when I've posted, and that hasn't been as much recently, because I think I'm writing in a lot of different ways, and that's really helped me generate the ideas and say, oh yeah, this is something that I could craft into a post, and it would be meaningful. I even my blog posts take me hours to compose, because I want them to just feel right, and I want to make sure that they flow as well to a reader as they do in my jumbled head, which is tricky. But yeah, I think the more I write, the relationship between that kind of short writing, though, and writing a book is fascinating because I've written many books worth of words in my life, but that doesn't prepare you for putting together a book of something that's over 200 pages. It's a different animal. My short writing is more like braiding cords or weaving or knitting or weaving a tapestry, but books are like quilts, and I don't know anything about quilting.
Yeah, it is a different beast. But in the way that the book is written, I mean, knowing that you were a journalist, like I think it shows in the writing because you have such a great way of like weaving quotes from all of the contributors that you interviewed about what depression is like for them and how they deal with it. And I just thought that was done really beautifully in the book, how all those voices are kind of woven together. So maybe you're making a really big tapestry instead of a quilt.
You're probably right. I'll tell you, I really appreciate you saying that because I spent a lot of time sifting through and reading and rereading all of the quotes from my interviews just to see how they would fit together. And I organized them in a bunch of different ways. And, usually I'm the guy who, like, if I write a newspaper article, I start at the beginning and I write it through, and then when I finish, I'm done and I don't look at it again. Mm-hmm. And that's something else you can't do with a book. You have to be willing to look at it again and again and again, because it's not just going to be, whatever it is, because there's a lot of layers to it. And it's, I guess it's also like a complicated cake.
Yes. Well, and I think, with a book length work, you've looked at it so many times by the time you hand it off to the next person to edit or, do whatever. Like, you're convinced it's terrible because you're just bored with the language or bored with what, it's just like, I've seen this so many times. Like, there's not that element of surprise as you're reading. So I think it is really, it's difficult to just it's difficult to get distance from it, to really see what you have. And then also, just like you said, the layering of it and how many times you touch it is so different.
That's why I had to be, I was very trusting in Heather and my other editors. What they told me to do, I just did.
Yeah, I think that's important.
That could be tough for some writers.
Yeah, I mean, there's an ego thing there, but I think it's so important to let other people come in there and, I don't know, kick around the dust and all that kind of stuff. So you started working on this book during the pandemic, before the pandemic, and then kind of wrote into the pandemic with it. So what was that like, working on a topic that suddenly became really important to a lot of people while you were working on it?
Yeah, I'll tell you, when everything shut down and I was laid off from my job and my wife started teaching at home, I said, I have more time to write this book. And wow, do we ever need this book? I was not at all surprised to see the statistics about depression just shooting through the roof. And it was kind of chilling. It's like, as I said, I didn't ask to write this book, but it seems like it was the right time to write this book.
So, I mean, like you said, Llewellyn asked you, or Heather Green approached you to ask you about the book. But clearly there's a seed of you in this book too. So I've read the book, so I kind of know the answer to this question, but for the folks listening, like, where is the impetus for this book for you? Like, why is this the book she thought you were the person to write?
When I agreed to write the book, I committed to writing it both as a journalist and as a bit of a memoir. Depression is something I have a long history with, and it goes back probably at least to middle school or junior high, as we called it in the ancient days. And it was I think every new experience we have as humans has the potential to be completely overwhelming, no matter how much we know about it ahead of having it. And that includes experience with drugs, with sex, with different emotions. And I think many people, and myself included, found the experience of depression to be completely overwhelming. And it's not at all a surprise that there's a small number of people who are actually killed by the experience, because it is an incredibly crippling thing. And I went through some really tough times in especially my young adulthood with the condition. And it took a long time to get to the point where I felt I could talk a little bit about it, because the nature of depression is such that you're internally discouraged from discussing anything about it. I think we talk about the stigma that we have in our society about mental health issues. I think that stigma isn't necessarily from we as a whole as it is from we as individuals. Each and every one of us say, oh no, we can't talk about that. And at least I know there are other societies where it's more okay, but the voice in your head when you have depression is a strong encouragement to shut up and trust me, this is just going to be fine. You should just hide in your room with some ice cream and don't talk to anyone for 2 weeks.
We touched a little bit before, and my struggle is with anxiety, which, we said they walk hand in hand a lot, but they're different in many ways. And I think at that part, they're similar, is that, we do talk about being anxious as a culture, but I don't think we talk about what the actual impacts of that are, like what those look like. And people don't really want to talk about it. It's like with isolation, with the pandemic, if you were already anxious, talk about layering it on thick. It's been a challenge. So I think, I think this book is really well timed. And I think in addition to you writing it as a journalist and as a memoir, there's also like a kind of a workbook aspect to the book, with the exercises and the rituals and the spells. I mean, it was like reading through it, I was kind of, because I was reading it to interview you, and just because I was also interested in the topic, that like I really wanted to stop and do all the exercises, but I was like, I really need to get through the book in a timely fashion. So it's, I don't really have time for that. But they're so appropriately placed in the book. And the one that really, like the Depenon, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, for depression, the meal for Hecate.
Yeah.
It was so moving just to read the ritual. So can you talk a little bit about like actually performing that ritual, and then how you translated that so other people could perform the ritual in instructions?
Oh, sure. Depenon is a traditional ancient Greek dinner for the dead and Hecate, and the way it's practiced in my own group, Temenos Oikirios, involves taking what we call miasma and asking Hecate to take it from your home and your life. Miasma is a sort of complicated topic. It is not sin, as you know, most pagan traditions don't really recognize the concept of sin. I think of it as more of the gunk that tends to accumulate on you because you happen to be a living being, and that can get in the way of your openness to the gods and to the good blessings of life. And this particular ritual is about asking Hecate to soak it all up in a special preparation of water with things like onion and ouzo and spices and such, and you stick a candle in your bowl and walk around your house and ask Hecate to take it all in. Hecate is known mythologically for being the torchbearer, the one who walked with Demeter in the night to help her find Persephone and carried the torch. And it's in the darkness that we can look for Hecate to bring the light. And when I learned about this ritual, when I started on this path, it occurred to me that depression has a lot of similarities to miasma. And I thought that maybe Hecate would be open to helping soak it up the way miasma is taken up. And that's how I adapted this to be something that you can do for depression in particular.
Mm-hmm. So when you were looking at, like, I think that one, especially because I think that's one of the longer kind of ritual exercises, if you want to call it exercise, in the book, like, I think what you captured is like what it actually looks like. But how did you go about like writing those instructions? Like, how did you think about making sure that this was something, like, I think it's spells are kind of almost like a recipe, but this is a little more involved than that.
Yes, I adapted the ritual script that we use in my tradition, because it covers all of the ways that you're supposed to approach the gods according to the practice that we follow, which involves purification and acknowledging spirits in different ways and giving the gods offerings of food and of drink. And by trusting in something that I was already familiar with in terms of that ritual script, I think I was able to, it sounds like you might agree that I was able to come up with something that someone unfamiliar with those practices might be able to find the right relationship with Hecate for doing this work, even if this is an unfamiliar deity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I thought it was, like I said, it was just moving just to read through the order of the ritual, because it like you said, it though I knew you adapted it specifically for this, dealing with depression issue, like it is obviously a practice that's done for other reasons and more often than like you're going to do this for depression. But I know it's made me really want to delve more into Hellenistic practice, which I have always kind of just been interested in because, childhood mythology obsession, but now I'm like, oh, maybe I need to do a little more reading in this vein. But it was, I think for me, it was like just like a really good point in the book to kind of reflect on everything he'd said to you about how to deal with depression and how I think a lot of our discussion around health and mental health does leave out the spiritual aspect. And this is a really like embodied spiritual expression to deal with it. So
I think it's very important not only to address the spiritual aspect, but to ensure that we don't address it to the exclusion of other aspects. I am a very strong advocate in addressing the body and the mind as well as the spirit, because they're all afflicted by depression. And really, and the idea of mental health being different from physical health is terribly misleading.
I appreciated all of those call outs in the book about this, separation of the mind and the body in our look at health and how, it serves neither, basically. So I think you make a good point of that in the book multiple times too, which I appreciated. So like with the ritual and with all of these things in the book that look at, like you said, you are looking at treating depression in like a medical sense, both treating mind and body. And then this aspect of looking at it as a spiritual. Did you feel like writing the book actually changed your practice or deepened your practice while you were working on it?
It really did. One of the longer term exercises in the book is about building a depression shrine and a depression totem, and this is something I'd never done until I realized, oh, this is something I should be doing. I've been spending a lot of time during my research phase trying to think about what tools I might have wished to have had years ago. Mm-hmm. And this one just kind of came to me through a variety of channels. And I said, well, I have to test this out to see how it works before I can move ahead with it, because you read a lot of things in books that make you say, I wonder if anyone's ever actually done that. And often I'll actually try them. If I read something in a book that looks insane, I was like, okay, let me see if I can actually make this thing work. And that's why I felt really like I had to make sure that this one was going to work. And it really, really helped me clarify that you can have an external relationship with depression and not have it necessarily be in your head. And it's going to make it easier for you to recognize that it's not you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that aspect of it really does translate for anxiety really well, that this is like you said, kind of a spirit that you're dealing with. And I was like, oh, how can I adapt this idea of a depression alter for anxiety? So, I mean, I think it would work pretty similarly in many ways, because it is kind of it is a voice in your head. It's something that you wrestle with in a lot of the same ways.
The trick is figuring out what the spirit wants.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think what you talk about in the book about like, what is the purpose of depression? Like what, is what is, I guess, the evolutionary reason that we deal with depression? Like I've often asked that about anxiety. Like what is the biological import that this is even possible to deal with? And I mean, I've always kind of come back to depression as like, it's some kind of protection, right? It's like, or with anxiety, it's like some kind of protection. Like your mind is telling you don't do this thing because it's dangerous or it will hurt you. Or even if it's an irrational thing, like leaving your apartment, which,
yeah.
But I think it's, I think looking at it when it's difficult to understand or parse it that way, like this way of looking at it in a spiritual sense and as something that is kind of outside of you as much as it is part of you, gives you a totally different perspective.
It's also, I think, a lot harder to wrestle with anything if you frame it as an enemy you have to fight. Mm-hmm. And what you just said about anxiety, I think is true with depression, that it means well and it wants you to be safe. And if you recognize that even though it's hurting you, it might not be out to get you, I think it really changes the dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I hope that people will listen to this conversation. If they deal with either of these issues, they will realize that there's a lot in this book for both sides of this particular feast, spirit, feast. But so talking about readers though, what as you're writing the book and now the book is out in the world, what do you really hope people take from this? And I mean, what do you want kind of, I guess, what was your responsibility to the readers of this book and what do you hope they take away from it?
I think I'd be thrilled if this book resulted in other people writing books with different perspectives on this question. I think we need to have more conversations about that fuzzy area between mental health and spirituality, because in this time and in this place, there's an assumption by a lot of people that spirituality is a sign of poor mental health, and that's not true. But it makes it difficult to distinguish between the two. I would like for my readers to recognize that there are options and that maybe my options aren't the best ones. I hope some of them are. It sounds like for you, Victoria, maybe some of them do resonate, and I'd love to hear that that's the case. But, there are other traditions. I didn't try to write a generic book because I find those hard to read. I wrote a book from my own perspective with my own traditions, and I hope it makes it easier for people to say, oh, well, since I'm a heathen, what I should be doing is this sort of thing. And maybe I can be appealing to ex gods or something, or, if I'm a Methodist, maybe this is the way I should be relating. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of people who are unwilling to not only talk about depression, but maybe even think about it. And I'd be thrilled if there are people who recognize that maybe they need help because they read this book, and that it's okay to seek help.
Mm-hmm. I think what you said is interesting about looking at it from different traditions and perspectives. Because one of the things, and I think you actually wrote a blog post about this, because I went and checked out your blog too, just because, I do a little internet stalking before I interview someone, about the different gods from different traditions. So I think, most of the ones you mentioned in that list are obviously like pagan or heathen or gods. But, in your bio, and like you said, if you're a Methodist, how do you approach this? I think, it isn't something that's unique to one spiritual path by any stretch to have this kind of thought about it.
Yeah.
How did you decide? I mean, I guess kind of like in a research bent, how did you decide on that list? Like what were you looking for in kind of these aspects of these deities to get them on the list, I guess, on the list you made?
My approach really comes from my background as a jester and fool. I dove headlong into it, not even really sure what I was going to ask people. And the idea of there being different specific gods to relate to really came out of those different conversations. I had several people say, yes, there are gods of death who are very interested in walking with you when you're in that place, and others who talk about the light bringers. And I hadn't actually thought about it, even though I am a polytheist. I hadn't really thought about, who are the different gods that understand this stuff, because during a period of depression, you feel abandoned. You feel abandoned by the humans around you, even though they're not. You feel abandoned by the gods around you, even though you're not. And some gods just seem to be better at overcoming that nonsense in your head. And that's a very important thing to realize. And yeah, I had no idea that was something that was going to come out of it, which is part of why the whole book writing process is challenging for me, because it's like, oh, okay, who needs to write questions ahead of time? Let's just see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had another question. I lost it. Is there something particular in the book that you felt like this had to be part of this? Like this was like a no negotiation with your editor part of the book that you really felt had to stay in?
I think the stuff where I discussed suicide was really important. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I actually say is that in and of itself, suicide isn't a bad thing. The problem is that when you're in a state of depression, when that's what's motivating you to make that really big decision, you're doing it alone. And this is not a decision that you can make alone because it has huge impacts. And if you're not in a place where you can talk to other people and say, hey, I'm thinking of ending my life, would you be willing to help with that? Then it's probably not a good time to do it. There are people who are at that point in their life where they can make that decision with family and friends. Most of them are not in depression at that time.
Yeah.
And if someone had said, we can't talk about that, that's just too charged, I would have said, that's really something we need to stick with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that difference that you talk about in the book between like having a terminal illness where you are actively suffering physical pain or deterioration and having those conversations, like you're still able to make that decision. You're still able to have that conversation with your friends and family about what your choices are is very different. That's kind of what you're talking about. The same.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The other thing I found challenging about suicide and its relationship to depression is that, in addition to is how other people will react to the idea that someone might be feeling that way. There's tends to be two common reactions, which is, oh, you're being dramatic, and oh, we need to lock you up. Mm-hmm. Generally, neither of those is the best reaction. There is a middle road where you can listen to how people are feeling, and you can listen for dangerous clues, like they have a specific plan and the means to enact that plan that suggests that they might need immediate help. But most people are just trying to find ways to process emotions that are well beyond them, and they need to be taken seriously, but they need to be taken seriously by the people in their lives, not necessarily by I have been through it all. I've worked through my process in a locked ward, and I've worked through it with therapists, and I've processed it with friends, and I've had it dismissed by friends. Mm-hmm. And it is tricky because we don't understand how to help one another in our culture. And generally it's about spending the time to listen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you made a good point in the book about like, and the word has escaped me, but basically sending someone to be hospitalized against their will. I know there's a term for it. It just kind of flew out of my head. That isn't necessarily going to help everybody and can exacerbate a situation where you're then taking all control away from this person, especially in a mental health system in this country that, may not have a bed for them, or the bed for them is hundreds of miles away, and then further removing them from their community. And I just thought that was, an interesting thing and good to say, because I know I've just seen it happen to other people that, this hold and putting them in a bed far away was not helpful in that situation. So I thought it was
understandable.
Yeah.
One of the people I interviewed, Anthony Rella, is a licensed therapist, and spoke about the tremendous weight of that, of having to do that, and how it's a responsibility you have to take very seriously, and doesn't happen very often. Mm-hmm. But it's good to have a professional's opinion in some cases.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like you said, depression is something that wants to isolate you from everything, but it's like really when you need more input from professionals, from loved ones, from your gods, everything. Like you need more input and you're being pushed to isolate at the same time. So.
If you recognize you're in depression, it's often a good idea to do the opposite of what you think is the best thing to do.
That's a good way to put it. That's a very good way to put it. So what's on the horizon for you writing wise? Like, what do you have any upcoming projects you can talk about, or?
I have a few things I am batting around. I am looking at perhaps doing a more in-depth book about the tradition that I follow, with co-written with someone who has a lot more experience in it. I would love to have the opportunity to do a book about pagans and how we relate to money. And I I'm sure at some point I'm going to find a way to write a book that introduces my cats.
I like that. I think you hit on two very important pagan topics there. I think money is always a topic, and cats always a topic. So, seems almost universal. Great. Where are the best places for your readers to connect with you?
I've collected all of my social media and such at my website, truepaganwarrior.com. It's easier to spell than my name, but I do maintain Facebook and Instagram and even Twitter for some reason.
I've described Twitter as both screaming into the void and drinking from the fire hose at the same time.
Never talk about grammar on Twitter. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I admire editors on Twitter who talk about that stuff. It's like, you're opening big old can of worms. Oh, it sounds good. So you know about this because I sent you some questions in advance, but our last question on the show is a little bit of a game of chance. And it gives us an opportunity to talk about, not that we haven't talked about a lot of these things already, but I'm going to roll a die, and depending on what number I roll, 1 for death, 2 for sex, 3 for religion, 4 for politics, and 5 for money. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one we talk about. So it sounds like you might actually be gunning for money this time.
Let's see.
5. Money. Woohoo. There we go. The gods are with us today. So I actually came up with a really easy question for you, but now we'll start with this, but I think we'll go another place. Once can money buy happiness, whether you're a pagan or not?
I like the idea that that money can make it a whole lot easier to be happy, but clearly we have a highly unhealthy relationship with money. If you have too much, it becomes an addiction. If you have too little, it becomes a survival issue. And for most people in the middle, it's just a source of anxiety. I think that money and happiness can walk together, but yeah, I don't think it can directly buy it.
No, I agree. But so what if you were going to give someone a piece of advice about finding that middle ground with money, where would you start?
Well, if they are in some kind of a partnership, such as a marriage, I would say that the place to start is to actually talk about your feelings about money with your partner. For those people who aren't fortunate enough to have that, have a partner to bounce it off, I think that writing, a friend of mine gave me this idea, and I know it's not original, of writing a love letter to money, talking about what you aspire to in your relationship with money, to find what's good about money in your life, because we can distort our lives by being too attentive to money or not attentive enough in our society. And it's very easy to allow us to try to quantify every aspect of our lives. And that's wonderful for certain things, the fungible things in life, but most of our lives are non-fungible.
Right. So, I mean, I guess one of the things I always think about with money is like why it is such a taboo topic. And I think it's sometimes, though we, in the pagan community or in witchcraft community or, however you label the community that you're in or part of, like there's always like, here's a money spell, here's this oil, here. It's such a topic of conversation, but we don't ever really talk about what the money's for or what it, why we're in this position where this is such a conversation in the pagan community, that this is clearly why you want to write a book. But do you have some thoughts about that?
Most money spells confuse me. They make me, they feel like people are performing sex magic as a way to get laid. They just seem to be very cyclical and circular, and I don't know how much good that is. I think what we miss with our with money work is what does the money want? I think that money has its own intentions, just like everything else, and that it might not necessarily be about lining our pockets. I think money has a job to do, and money is very curious. It likes to travel. And if we can find ways to work with money that fit in with its nature, I think it would work a whole lot better. Like I had a friend who did this amazing spell to find a job, writing the intention on a dollar bill of what kind of job my friend wanted, and then changed it at the bank for 100 pennies and put those pennies around town heads up so that Lincoln could be on the lookout for that job.
I like that.
And that really works with the way money works. And I think that we miss a lot of that when we're talking about money. I think part of the reason why money is taboo is because since it is all about quantity, it gives us an opportunity to measure things. You know, if I tell you how much money I make and you tell me how much money you make, well, we're comparing each other based on that number. Mm-hmm. You know, does that make me a better or worse person if I have a different bottom line income than you do? I don't think so, but the gut reaction is often going to be yes, whether or not you think so intellectually. Is like, oh, of course it makes me a better person. And it's not money's fault that we think of it that way. It's something about the way we're wired. It's like, you know, we have opium receptors, and it's not opium's fault that there's heroin addiction, but for some reason we're wired that we love the stuff. And that seems to be how it is with money too. It brings us some value, but boy, it's a wild ride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting when you say about like that it's a tool for measurement. And I think for me, the interesting part of using money as a tool for measurement, it's like on what our culture values more than on how much we make. Like what is our government? What does our culture decide? You know, that teachers have to have bake sales and use their own money to buy classroom supplies. And we pay movie stars millions of dollars to be in a movie. Like that to me, that part of money I find fascinating, like what our culture values.
Yeah, it's really just amplifying the gestalt, which is kind of troublesome when you look at how it's amplified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. So, well, clearly I'm looking forward to your money book. And I think hopefully Llewellyn or somebody else will go, yes, Terence, this is the next book for you to write, because I think it'd be fascinating. But I so appreciate you being on the show and talking with me. I know this is like a difficult topic for a lot of people to talk about depression and mental health in general. And so I'm just glad we had the opportunity to do that. And I hope folks get something out of our conversation as well as your book.
I agree. I think if I hear that somebody tells me that they found a way to get into a better relationship with this spirit, I think that's all I would want.
That's a good measure of success, I think. Thank you. WitchLit is a production of Thousand Bolt Press and is edited by Keifel Agostini, who also designed our logo. Our music is Voices, composed for us by Alexander Shanekar. You can support our work, get early access to episodes, ask your own death, sex, religion, politics, money question, and get some free stuff by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/WitchLitPod. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at witchlitpod. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and give us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other witches find the show. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.